My name is First Lieutenant Rose Peeney, 32 years old, and this is the moment my silence died. That night, when my jaw cracked under the fist of my husband, Captain Jackson Thorne, for failing to give him a child, and for the sake of his mistress. From the doorway, my mother-in-law, Matilda, smiled in approval. "You deserved that, you useless thing." But even as the blow landed, even through the humiliation, I smiled. They had no idea what was coming. If you're watching this video, let me know where you're from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe, because my story might just be the weapon you need for your own war. The heavy front door clicked shut, the sound echoing through the hallway with a finality that vibrated up from the floorboards. Jax was gone. Probably on his way to her, to Serafina. Matilda had left moments before him, her expensive perfume still hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. I remained on the cold, polished hardwood, my cheek pressed against the grain of the wood. The house was finally quiet. A salty, metallic taste filled my mouth, warm and thick. I didn't cry. Tears were a luxury, a resource I hadn't been able to afford for a long time. Instead, my fingers moved slowly, deliberately, tracing the sharp, burgeoning ache along my jawline. It was swelling fast. And then, a genuine smile spread across my lips, pulling at the split corner of my mouth. The smile wasn't for them. It wasn't born of pain or madness. It was for the tiny secret nestled safely in the inner seam of my Army OCP trousers. A micro USB drive, no bigger than a thumbnail, waterproof and discreet. On it was my life's work for the past 6 months. A meticulously organized cache of every copied email, every recorded phone call, every suspicious financial transaction that painted the full, damning picture of their betrayal. That punch hadn't been the beginning of my suffering. It was the signal for their end. My body ached, but it was a dull, familiar pain. The real wound, the one that felt fresh and fatal, came from the memory of Matilda's smile. It was a cool, satisfied curve of her lips as she watched her son strike me. That image burned behind my eyes, far brighter than the blooming bruise on my face. Just last week, after the Sunday service at the post chapel, she had squeezed my hand, her rings digging into my skin. "I've always thought of you as the daughter I never had, Rose," she'd whispered, her voice thick with false sincerity. Now those words echoed in my head as a cruel, mocking joke. Betrayal from a husband was a common tragedy. But betrayal from another woman, a mother, a figure who was supposed to represent some kind of sanctuary, that was a different kind of wound. It was a poison that seeped deeper than any physical blow could ever reach. In that moment, staring at the dust bunnies under the console table, I understood a terrible, clarifying truth. I was utterly and completely alone in this fight. There were no allies for me within these walls. There were only enemies with smiling faces. I thought of Pat Tillman. The thought came out of nowhere, a memory from a different lifetime. A professional football player who gave up a multi-million-dollar contract to enlist after 9/11, only to die in the mountains of Afghanistan. His was a sacrifice for a cause, for a nation, for something bigger than himself. It had meaning. For years, I had been sacrificing myself in this house, my career opportunities, my emotional well-being, my own identity, for nothing. For a lie. My suffering had been meaningless, not anymore. With a grunt, I pushed myself up, my ribs screaming in protest. I walked, steady and measured, into the master bathroom and flipped on the harsh vanity lights. The woman in the mirror stared back. One side of her face was beginning to blossom with the deep purple and blue of a fresh bruise. But I looked past the injury, into her eyes. I didn't see a victim. I saw an intelligence officer who had just been handed the most critical mission of her life. I remembered the oath I took when I joined the Army, my right hand raised, my voice clear and unwavering. I swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I had always pictured that domestic enemy as a terrorist on American soil. I never imagined they would be sleeping in the bed down the hall. Looking at my own reflection, I raised my right hand, just as I had all those years ago. And I made a new vow, a silent one. I will use the very discipline you praise, the same code you pretend to uphold to put you in the ground. That night, sleep was not an option. Adrenaline and purpose were a more potent combination than any coffee. I sat in my small home office, the door locked, and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I entered the 24-character password and opened the first folder in a project code named Operation Steel Dawn. I clicked on the very first piece of evidence I'd ever found, the one that started it all. It was an email from Jax to Matilda, sent 2 months prior. The subject line was chillingly simple: the Rose Problem. My eyes scanned the words I'd already memorized. They discussed how to encourage me to seek a voluntary mental health evaluation. They talked about fabricating a narrative of PTSD, of emotional instability, planting the seeds with his commanding officer that I was becoming erratic. Their goal was clear: to build a case that would force me into a medical discharge, a quiet, convenient way to end not only our marriage, but my career. They didn't just want to get rid of me, they wanted to erase me. They wanted to strip me of the one thing I had left that was truly mine: my service, my rank, my honor. I closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the silent room. A cold, hard certainty settled in my gut. This wasn't going to be a divorce. This was total war. My personal campaign needed a name. I called it Operation Steel Dawn. It was a mission that began not with a bang, but with the quiet, disciplined clicks of a keyboard in the dead of night. I remembered a speech by Admiral William H. McRaven I'd watched years ago. He said, "If you want to change the world, start off by making your bed." It was about the power of small daily disciplines. My bed was already made. My new discipline was dismantling my husband's life, piece by methodical piece. My SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, had taught me how to operate in hostile territory. I never imagined that territory would be my own 2-story home in a quiet Fayetteville suburb. But that's what it had become. A place where I had to survive, evade detection, and resist the psychological warfare being waged against me, all while planning my escape. The first step was intelligence gathering. I installed a discreet keylogger onto our shared family computer, a simple piece of software that was undetectable to the average user. It captured every password, every search query, every private message typed on that keyboard. Next, my phone. North Carolina is a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record any conversation I was a part of. An app ran silently in the background, documenting every call, every lie, every feigned term of endearment from Jax. Then came the financials. For weeks, I spent my nights poring over months of credit card statements, a highlighter in hand, a pot of black coffee at my elbow. The patterns began to emerge from the noise of grocery bills and gas receipts. There were dinners for two at expensive restaurants in Raleigh I'd never been to. Jewelry purchases from online boutiques shipped not to our address, but to a P.O. box across town. Each transaction was a data point. Each data point was a bullet. I loaded them, one by one, into a password-protected spreadsheet, building a detailed map of his betrayal. But the most horrifying discovery, the one that truly revealed the depths of their depravity, came from a hidden folder on Jax's laptop. It was named simply Project RP. My initials. Inside was a single document, a digital diary written in the first person under my name. It was a work of fiction, a masterpiece of psychological sabotage. It chronicled, in painstakingly crafted detail, a fictional descent into madness. There were entries describing vivid nightmares of my last deployment, panic attacks in the middle of the Fort Bragg commissary, and admissions of suicidal thoughts. The language was sophisticated, laced with therapeutic buzzwords designed to paint a convincing portrait of a female officer crumbling under the weight of severe PTSD, no longer fit for service. He had stolen my identity, my voice, and twisted it into a weapon to destroy me. As I read the words he had written for me, a wave of cold nausea washed over me. I had to brace myself against the desk to keep from being sick. This wasn't just infidelity. This wasn't just cruelty. This was a meticulously calculated crime, designed to strip me of my honor and my very sanity in the eyes of the institution I had sworn my life to. Maintaining composure became my new full-time job. A few weeks later, at a mandatory Brigade Family Day event, I was playing the part of the supportive Army wife, smiling and making small talk over paper plates of lukewarm barbecue. The entire time, I felt like a spy, cataloging the sympathetic glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. They were already seeding the ground with their lies. That's when Maggie O'Connell appeared at my elbow. The wife of a command sergeant major, Maggie was a legend in the Fort Bragg community. A tough, no-nonsense woman with kind eyes who had seen it all. She steered me away from the crowd toward the relative privacy of the bleachers. "You don't look okay, kid," she said, her voice low and direct. She didn't press for details. She didn't pry. She just saw me. "Listen to me," she continued, her gaze steady. "If you ever need a safe place to store something, or just an ear that won't judge, my basement is always open. No questions asked." That simple, unsolicited offer of kindness from a woman I barely knew was the lifeline I didn't know I was drowning for. It was a flicker of light in the absolute darkness of my isolation. That night, after making a mirror image copy of my micro USB drive, I met her on a quiet side street. I passed her the duplicate. It was an insurance policy, not just for my evidence, but for my life. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that elevated their conspiracy from a personal betrayal to a federal crime, came from Jax's own arrogance. He left a single sheet of paper on his desk in our home office, face up, as if it were nothing. It was an invoice from a private obstetrics clinic downtown. My hands were perfectly steady as I picked it up. The patient's name was Serafina Vance, but it was the insurance section that made my blood run cold. The policy listed was TRICARE, the military's health insurance. The sponsor's name on that policy was mine, First Lieutenant Rose Peeney. And the procedure code listed next to the exam notes. Prenatal care. He wasn't just cheating. He wasn't just planning to leave me. He was actively committing federal insurance fraud, using my name and my military benefits to pay for the care of his mistress and their fabricated child. I didn't take the invoice. Instead, I took out my phone and photographed it, capturing the document from every angle, the light glinting off the embossed clinic logo. The metadata on those photos would be an unshakable timestamp. I walked back to my office and opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. Inside was a simple manila folder, now thick with printed emails, call transcripts, and financial statements. I placed the original USB drive inside. The file was no longer a collection of suspicions. It was an indictment. Operation Steel Dawn was fully armed and ready. The morning after the assault, my phone buzzed on the nightstand with a text message. It was from a number I recognized but had rarely used. Maggie O'Connell. "Meet me at the morning MOTD at 900. My treat." I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. The bruise on my jaw had faded from a violent purple to a mottled, sickly yellow-green. A constellation of betrayal that I'd been carefully concealing with makeup. The thought of sitting under the bright lights of a public place felt like stepping onto a stage, exposed. But something in the simple directness of her message, an order almost softened by an offer, felt trustworthy. The morning MOTD was a small, cozy coffee shop tucked away in a downtown Fayetteville strip mall, a well-known sanctuary for military spouses and soldiers looking for a moment of peace. The name was an inside joke for the community. The message of the day was a standard part of any military morning formation. Here, it meant good coffee and a quiet corner. The air inside smelled of roasted coffee beans, cinnamon, and warm sugar. Maggie was already at a table in the back, a steaming mug in her hands. She looked up as I approached, her eyes skipping over my face without lingering on the bruise. There was no pity in her gaze, only a quiet, steady acknowledgement. She simply pointed to the chair opposite her. A steaming cinnamon latte and a large blueberry scone were already waiting for me. "Eat," she said, her voice calm and even. It wasn't a suggestion. Fighting on an empty stomach is a bad tactic. That small, practical act of kindness, the complete absence of invasive questions, did what my husband's fist could not. It almost made me cry. It was the first time in months someone had offered me something without expecting anything in return. It was nourishment, plain and simple. I wrapped my cold hands around the warm mug and took a sip, letting the sweet, spicy coffee chase away some of the chill that had settled deep in my bones. On the chalkboard menu behind the counter, a quote was written in elegant cursive. It was from Maya Angelou. "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." I had seen who Jax and Matilda were. I was done making excuses for them. In the safety of that small booth, surrounded by the low hum of conversation and the clinking of ceramic, I let the mask of the stoic officer slip, just for a moment. I didn't tell her about the violence, not in detail. The words were too ugly. Instead, I spoke of the crushing weight of my isolation, of the feeling of being trapped in a life that was no longer my own. Maggie just listened, nodding slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, she shared stories from her own 30 years as an army wife. She spoke of the power plays and the fake smiles at brigade holiday parties, the carefully guarded secrets behind the closed doors of officers' housing. "This world," she said, gesturing vaguely to the world outside the coffee shop window, "it's built on appearances. It can chew up and spit out good people like you if you let it. You have to be smarter than they are, and you have to know who you're really fighting." Her expression shifted then. The warmth in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping lower. "You need to know what you're up against, Rose. This isn't just about an affair. This is bigger than that. Have you ever wondered why Matilda despises you so much? Why she's so obsessed with Jax having an heir?" I shook my head, my heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Maggie took a deep breath, as if bracing herself. "Because Seraphina Vance is her biological daughter." The words landed in the quiet space between us with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs. I could only stare at her, trying to process the impossible. "Matilda had her out of wedlock, a long time ago," Maggie explained, her voice low and steady. "From a secret affair, before she ever married General Thorne. It would have been a career-ending scandal back then. So she gave the baby up for a closed adoption. She spent the last 30 years searching for her, and a few years ago, she found her." A bomb went off in my head, a silent, blinding detonation that rearranged every fact I thought I knew. Suddenly, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Matilda's constant, simmering hostility, Seraphina's unbelievable audacity, her sense of entitlement, Jax's willing, easy complicity in it all. This wasn't a messy family tragedy. It was a long con. A meticulously planned conspiracy to steal my life and hand it to someone else. I wasn't just the wife being cheated on. I was a target, a placeholder, an obstacle to be removed so Matilda could install her long-lost daughter into the position of power and prestige she believed was her birthright. The fake diary, the plot to have me discharged, the sham pregnancy, it was all part of a single, monstrous plan. The initial shock was quickly being consumed by something else, a cold, clarifying rage. It was the kind of rage that didn't scream, but focused. The kind of rage that sharpens your vision and steadies your hand. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment of terrible clarity where the entire ugly truth snaps into focus and you finally understand the game you're in. If you are standing with me against the Matildas of the world, show your support by hitting that like button. And in the comments, just type one word: unbreakable. Let them know we're still here. I looked at Maggie, my own eyes now as cold and clear as hers. The fear that had been my constant companion for months was gone, burned away by the heat of this new reality. I finally knew who the real enemy was. And I knew exactly what I had to do. The calm that followed my meeting with Maggie was the deep, still air before a hurricane. I knew they were planning their next move, and it came 3 days later, not with a confrontation, but with a quiet digital invasion. It was delivered via an email, accidentally forwarded to me by Jax. The invitation on my screen was a garish assault of pastel pink and baby blue, adorned with animated rattles and storks. It was a digital announcement card designed by Matilda with her signature lack of subtlety. The cheerful, looping cursive read, "You're invited to celebrate with us. A welcome home and baby announcement party for Captain Jackson Thorne and the woman of his heart, Seraphina Vance." My eyes scanned the details, each word a calculated twist of the knife. The date, this coming Saturday. The time, 1800 hours. And the location, printed in bold, festive letters, our address, my home. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. This wasn't a secret affair. It was a public coronation, an act of open conquest. They were declaring my home, their territory, my life, their prize. The invitation was a formal declaration that, in their eyes, I had already been erased. A knot of ice formed in my stomach, but my mind had never been clearer. Their arrogance was becoming a liability. An hour later, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed, Matilda Thorne. I let it ring twice before answering, my voice a carefully modulated flatline. "Hello, Matilda." "Rose, dear," she cooed, her voice dripping with a sweetness so thick it was nauseating. "I do hope I'm not bothering you. We're just having a small get-together for Jax on Saturday evening. A little celebration for his return." I stayed silent, letting her fill the space. "I know you haven't been feeling well lately," she continued, the fake concern practically oozing through the phone. "So I was thinking, perhaps it would be best if you spent the evening resting at a friend's house. It might all be a bit too much for you." "Don't you worry about a thing, dear. Seraphina and I will handle everything." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an eviction notice, a command disguised as care. She was casting me in the role of the frail, unstable wife who needed to be shielded from reality for her own good. She was trying to make me a ghost in my own home. "Thank you for your concern, Matilda," I replied, my voice betraying no emotion. "I'll consider it." I hung up before she could respond. The trap was laid. They expected me to either flee in humiliation or stay and have a hysterical breakdown. That evening, I got the final piece of their strategy. I was in my office when I heard their voices, Jax and Seraphini, drifting from the living room. My phone was already in my hand, the recording app open on the screen. I stood just inside the doorway, hidden by the shadows. "Are you sure about this, Jax?" Seraphina's voice was thin with anxiety. "What if she makes a scene? What if she starts screaming or something?" Jax let out a short, arrogant laugh. "She won't dare," he said with absolute certainty. "She's too terrified of losing her career." Mom already spoke to Colonel Miller. He's an old family friend. The second she shows a single sign of instability on Saturday night, he'll sign the order for a command-directed psych eval. It's the perfect trap. Either she shuts up and disappears quietly, or she speaks up and gets kicked out of the army for being crazy. I pressed the stop button on the recording, my hand steady. The file saved with a soft click. They weren't just overconfident, they were stupid. And they had just handed me the key to their own destruction. That night, as I lay in bed, the iconic voice of Jack Nicholson from an old movie, A Few Good Men, echoed in my head. "You can't handle the truth," I smiled in the darkness. They had built this entire charade on a foundation of lies. I decided it was time to force them to face a truth they were utterly incapable of handling. I did not leave. The next 2 days, I prepared. But I wasn't packing a suitcase. I was preparing a battlefield. I deep-cleaned the entire house until every surface gleamed under the lights. I polished the hardwood floors until they reflected the ceiling like a dark mirror. I wasn't playing the part of a housewife. I was sanitizing a theater of operations. I rearranged the patio furniture, not for conversational flow, but for clear, unobstructed lines of sight from the back door to the main hosting area. On Friday afternoon, I drove to the quartermaster laundry on post. The young specialist at the counter looked up, surprised to see an officer in this section. "Ma'am?" "I need to draw a new Class A uniform," I said, my voice crisp. "Dress blues, full set, for a formal event tomorrow." The Class A uniform is the Army's equivalent of a tuxedo. It's the highest form of dress uniform, reserved for the most solemn and significant occasions. The specialist looked confused. Is there a big ceremony I missed on the schedule, ma'am? I gave him a small, tight smile. A very important one. I'm attending an announcement ceremony. He nodded and went to the back to retrieve the perfectly pressed dark blue jacket and trousers, the crisp white shirt, the black tie. As I signed the hand receipt, I could feel the weight of the fabric, the symbolic power of the uniform. I wasn't going to this party as a scorned wife. I was attending as First Lieutenant Rose Peeney, United States Army. It was their party. But it was going to be my stage. It was T-minus 1 hour. The house, my house, was thick with the scent of a hostile occupation. Serafina's cloyingly sweet perfume, something expensive and floral that she must have sprayed with abandon, had seeped into the curtains and upholstery. It was a territorial marking, a declaration. That smell mingled with the rich aroma of catered food Matilda had arranged. The savory scent of miniature quiches and bacon-wrapped scallops drifted up the stairs, the kind of sterile, impersonal food served at officer promotion parties. The sounds were just as invasive. The faint clinking of wine glasses, Matilda's sharp, commanding laugh punctuating the low murmur of early guests. I remained in the master bedroom, the door closed, a silent island in the rising tide of their celebration. I was still in my civilian clothes, a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, sitting on the edge of the perfectly made bed. A quote from Sun Tzu's The Art of War echoed in my mind, a passage I'd studied extensively at West Point. All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when we are able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must appear inactive. For months, I'd appeared inactive, broken, and compliant. They saw a victim. They had no idea they were looking at a weapon. The bedroom door opened and Jack strode in. He was already mostly dressed in his Army service uniform, the deep blue trousers perfectly creased, the stark white shirt a brilliant, almost blinding contrast under the bedroom lights. The only thing missing was the formal jacket. His medals and ribbons were already affixed above the pocket, a colorful testament to a career he was actively disgracing. He paused when he saw me, his lips curling into a familiar sneer of contempt. "I thought you'd be smart enough to be gone by now," he said, his voice low and laced with menace. He turned his back to me, adjusting his black tie in the dresser mirror. "Don't ruin my night, Rose, for your own honor." Honor. The word hung in the air between us, so obscene in its hypocrisy it almost made me laugh. His honor was a costume, a set of medals pinned to a hollow core. He thought honor was about looking the part, about the crisp uniform and the confident smile at official functions. He had no concept of what it truly was. The quiet integrity, the difficult choices made when no one is looking, the loyalty to the people, and the principles you've sworn to protect. He was invoking my honor as a threat, as a cage to keep me in line, while he himself had set fire to the very meaning of the word. I stood up from the bed. My movements were slow, fluid, deliberate. There was no fear, no hesitation. The woman who would have flinched at his tone was gone, replaced by someone he had never met before. I walked toward him, my footsteps silent on the thick rug. "Honor, Jax?" I asked. My voice was quiet, even, and all the more terrifying for it. It was the voice I used to brief generals, a voice stripped of all emotion, leaving only cold, hard facts. He finally turned from the mirror to face me, irritation flashing in his eyes. "What did you say?" "I asked about honor," I repeated, stopping just a foot in front of him. "You're talking about honor while you are preparing to host a party for your mistress and a child that is not yours, in your wife's house. Using my insurance to pay for it all. Tell me, Captain, what exactly do you think that word means?" A frown creased his forehead. He saw the stillness in me, the complete absence of the fear he was used to, and it threw him off balance. A flicker of unease crossed his face. "What the hell are you talking about? You better watch your mouth." I didn't say another word. The time for words was over. This next move had to be an action, an act of psychological warfare. Deception. I rose up on my toes, a small, graceful movement that caught him off guard. Before his brain could process what was happening, before he could react or push me away, I leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. It was a phantom touch, light and fleeting, colder than it was warm. But it was not a kiss of affection, or forgiveness, or farewell. The corner of my lip, still tender and easily split from his fist a few days ago, was a weak point I had turned into a weapon. Just before I made contact, I bit down gently on the inside of my lip, a controlled sharp pressure just enough to break the skin. A single, warm bead of blood welled up, a tiny pinprick of crimson. When I pulled back, the result was perfect. A small, vivid smear of bright red blood marked the starched, pristine white collar of his dress shirt. It was a beautiful, deliberate stain, stark against the perfect white. I had placed it precisely, just under his jawline. A location impossible to hide with a jacket and impossible to clean quickly without smearing it, without making it worse. It was a mark of ownership, a brand. He stood frozen for a second, the condescending smirk wiped from his face. His hand flew to his collar, his fingers brushing against the wet stain. He pulled his hand away and stared at the red on his fingertips as if he'd been bitten by a snake. His eyes shot back to mine, and in them, I saw the predictable rage. But beneath it, something new. A deep, profound confusion. And for the very first time, a sliver of fear. He had no idea what game I was playing. "Are you crazy?" he hissed, his voice a choked whisper. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that didn't reach my eyes. This was not triumph. It was the calm, satisfying click of a well-laid trap being sprung. "That's so you'll remember me," I said softly. "So everyone out there sees my mark on you tonight. Have a wonderful party, Captain Thorne." Without waiting for a response, I turned my back on him, walked calmly into the ensuite bathroom, and closed the door behind me. I turned the lock. The soft, heavy click of the bolt sliding into place was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of a cage door shutting, of a new phase beginning. I left him out there alone, in the silent bedroom. A man trapped with the undeniable public symbol of his own violence and betrayal, staining the uniform he held up as the source of his honor. The party was about to begin. I stood behind the bathroom door, listening. The sounds of the party swelled from the backyard, a symphony of forced laughter, clinking glasses, and the low thrum of polite society conversation. Through the window, I could see the glow of the string lights Matilda had insisted on hanging, casting a warm, festive light on the faces of dozens of officers, senior NCOs, and their spouses. My own chain of command was out there. Jax's was too. This was the heart of the Fort Bragg social ecosystem, a place where careers could be made or broken over a glass of Chardonnay. My inspiration for this moment didn't come from a military manual. It came from a black and white photo in a history book. Rosa Parks, sitting on a bus, her posture quiet but her presence unyielding. A single dignified act of defiance that changed the world. She wasn't loud, she wasn't violent, she simply refused to be moved. Tonight, I would refuse to be erased. I took one final, steadying breath, my hand resting on the cool metal of the doorknob. My reflection in the full-length mirror was a stranger. It was not the tired, defeated woman of a week ago. This was First Lieutenant Rose Pina, immaculate in her Class A Army service uniform. The dark blue jacket was perfectly tailored, the brass buttons gleamed, and the rows of ribbons on my chest. My Army Commendation Medal, my Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, my parachutist badge, were a silent testament to my service. A history they had tried to rewrite. The party was at its peak. I could see the central trio holding court near the large oak tree. Jax, having hastily changed into another white shirt, stood with a proprietary hand resting on Serafina's stomach. He was laughing, a broad, confident smile plastered on his face. Serafina, wearing a flowing white dress, was glowing under the attention, playing the part of the radiant mother-to-be. And Matilda, a glass of champagne in hand, moved through the crowd like a queen surveying her court, accepting congratulations, her face a mask of triumphant pride. This was their victory celebration. This was my stage. I turned the knob, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the hallway. I walked through the living room, my polished low-quarter shoes making no sound on the hardwood floors, and stopped at the sliding glass door to the patio. I slid it open. The sudden rush of cool evening air was followed by a sudden, creeping silence. It started with the people closest to the door. A colonel's wife paused mid-sentence, her eyes widening. Her husband turned to see what she was looking at, and his conversation died too. The silence spread like a ripple in a pond, moving outward from me until all 50 guests had turned, their smiles frozen, their glasses paused halfway to their lips. Every conversation stopped. The only sound was the generic party music still playing softly from a Bluetooth speaker. My presence, in full dress uniform, had transformed their festive gathering into an unofficial military hearing. I ignored them all. My eyes locked on my target, and I moved with the unhurried purpose of a predator. I walked past Matilda without a glance. I walked past Jax as if he were a piece of furniture. My path was a straight line, directly to Serafina. She saw me coming, and the color drained from her face. I stopped in front of her. The air was electric. "That's a beautiful locket," I said, my voice clear and calm, carrying easily in the dead silence. I gestured to the small gold heart resting on her collarbone. "It means a great deal to me. My parents' pictures are inside." Serafina's hand flew to her neck, covering the locket in a reflexive, guilty gesture. Her eyes darted to Jax, then to Matilda, searching for a lifeline. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice a thin whisper. I looked directly into her eyes, holding her gaze. "Oh, I think you do," I said, letting a bead of silence hang in the air. "Just like you know that the baby you're pretending to carry is also a lie." A collective audible gasp went through the crowd. "Rose!" Matilda's voice was sharp, cutting through the stunned silence as she rushed to Serafina's side. "How dare you make such a scene? Have you lost your mind?" I finally turned my head, my gaze shifting from Serafina to Matilda, but my voice was pitched for everyone to hear. "I haven't lost my mind, Matilda. I'm not making a scene. I'm just telling the truth." My hand went to the inside pocket of my jacket and retrieved a single, crisp, white envelope. I held it out to Serafina. "This is a baby gift, from me to you. I thought you might need it." Her hand trembled as she took it from me. It wasn't a choice. It was an order. All eyes were on that envelope. With shaking fingers, she fumbled with the seal and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. It was a copy of the medical report from the obstetrics clinic. Her name, Serafina Vance, was clearly printed at the top. And at the bottom, in the doctor's clinical, unambiguous summary, was the conclusion: patient underwent a two-ball ligation procedure 2 years prior. Pregnancy is not a possibility. Serafina stared at the paper, her eyes wide with pure, unadulterated panic. Her head snapped up to look at Jax, a silent, desperate plea on her face. Then her eyes rolled back into her head, and she crumpled to the ground in a heap of white fabric, unconscious. Chaos erupted. A few women screamed. But Jax and Matilda didn't move. They were frozen, their faces ashen, their masks of social grace shattered into a million pieces. Their grand plan, their perfect narrative, had just been publicly executed in front of the very people whose opinions they valued more than anything. I stood there for a moment longer, calm and composed in the eye of the storm I had created. I let my gaze sweep across the shocked faces of their guests, meeting the eyes of colonels and their wives, of Jax's peers, and my own. I let them see me, not as a victim, but as the author of this moment. They brought the battle into my home, thinking I would surrender it without a fight. They were wrong. If you believe that every single one of us has the right to declare our own space a sanctuary, show your support and hit that like button. And in the comments, I want you to write 4 simple words for me. My house, my rules. Let's send them a message. Then, my voice, now filled with an authority they had never heard before, cut through the noise. The party is over. I waited a beat, letting the words sink in. I'm asking everyone who does not live in this house to leave my home, immediately. The 2 days following the party were defined by a silence so profound it was louder than any screaming match could ever be. Jax was gone, his clothes and personal effects removed from the house while I was at work, likely having retreated to his mother's strategic command post. There were no angry phone calls, no threatening text messages, no attempts at an apology. Nothing. I knew this wasn't surrender. This was them regrouping, re-strategizing. The silence was the low tide before a tsunami. I used the time to fortify my defenses. I made another encrypted backup of all my evidence, drove to a nondescript UPS store, and mailed it to a secure post office box I had opened under a different name. I then forwarded the tracking information to Maggie. We were operating on a need-to-know basis, and she needed to know that another copy of the arsenal was safely off-site. I was in the eye of the storm, and I knew the second, more violent wave was coming. I just didn't know from which direction. The storm made landfall on Tuesday morning. My company's first sergeant, a stern but fair man I respected, called me on my office phone. "Ma'am, the CO needs to see you in his office. Now." I walked the familiar hallway to my company commander's office, my boots sounding a steady, even rhythm on the linoleum floor. Captain Davis was a good man, a West Point graduate who had always treated me with professional respect. But today, as I entered his office and stood at parade rest before his desk, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He was intensely focused on straightening a stack of papers that was already perfectly aligned. That small nervous gesture told me everything. He was a good soldier, but he was caught between his duty and the immense pressure from the Thorne family's sphere of influence. Finally, he slid a single sheet of paper across his desk toward me. "I've been ordered to give you this, Pina." I picked it up. It was an official memorandum, printed on brigade letterhead. It was a formal order, signed by a colonel whose name I knew well, a notorious golfing buddy of Jax's father. The order was direct and brutal. "Effective immediately, First Lieutenant Rose Pina is hereby ordered to report to Womack Army Medical Center at 0900 tomorrow for a command-directed mental health evaluation." Under the reason section, a single line was typed: "Exhibiting erratic behavior and demonstrating signs of severe psychological instability." I read the words, and my hand did not shake. This was it. The move from their playbook I'd recorded them planning. They were executing their final, most vicious attack, a clinical, systematic effort to discredit me, to nullify every piece of evidence I possessed by officially labeling me as mentally incompetent. A soldier deemed unfit for duty has no credibility. Their testimony is worthless. Their career is over. It was a checkmate move, and they were playing it with the full weight of the U.S. Army's command structure behind them. I thought of Erin Brockovich, a single mom in a cheap pantsuit taking on a billion-dollar corporation. She didn't have an army behind her. All she had was the truth, meticulously documented. She reminded the world that one person with unshakable proof could indeed take down a giant. The Thorns were my PG&E. They thought their power made them invincible. They were about to learn otherwise. I looked up at Captain Davis, who was still avoiding my gaze. "I understand, sir," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I will comply with the order." But in my mind, my own counteroffensive, Operation Steel Dawn, was already in motion. I gave my commander a sharp salute, turned on my heel, and walked out of his office. The moment I was back in the privacy of my own office, I closed the door and made my first call. It wasn't to a lawyer, it was to the one office on post that even colonels fear, the Inspector General. "Inspector General's office, how may I help you?" a crisp voice answered. "My name is First Lieutenant Rose Pina," I said, my voice calm and professional. "I need to file an official complaint regarding a case of potential abuse of command authority, reprisal, and conduct unbecoming of an officer, and I have evidence." I gave the clerk my contact information and the essential details. They scheduled an appointment for me for first thing in the morning, 1 hour before my scheduled evaluation. My second call was to Maggie. "Maggie, it's Rose." "I was waiting for your call," she said, her voice steady. "What's happening?" "They made their move, command-directed psych eval." I heard her let out a long, weary sigh. Of course they did. The cowards. "It's time, Maggie," I said. "Execute Plan B. Please send the email to the address I gave you." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure, Rose? Once you do this, there's no going back. This goes public." "I am sure," I said, my voice as hard as the steel in my operation's name. "They've weaponized the system against me. It's time to show them what happens when the system decides to fight back. The email Maggie was sending contained a single, damning piece of evidence: the audio file of Jax, Matilda, and Serafina openly plotting to use a psych evaluation to destroy my career. The recipient was an investigative journalist at the Army Times, known for his relentless exposés on corruption within the ranks. He was my nuclear option. A last resort. The Thorns thought they had me trapped in a legal and medical corner. They didn't know I'd already rerouted the battle to a field of my own choosing. The hearing they wanted was about to happen. It just wasn't going to be about my sanity. It was going to be about their crimes. The next morning at precisely 0855 hours, I stood outside the Judge Advocate General's Corps building, on post. The building itself was imposing, a stately brick structure that housed the legal heart of the Army. This was where the rules were not just followed, but written. Where careers were dissected under the cold, impartial light of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Before I walked in, I sat in my car for a moment, the engine off, and pulled out the small, worn Bible I kept in my glove compartment. My hands were steady as I flipped to the page I'd marked. Psalm 23. My eyes found the 4th verse, the words of familiar balm to my spirit. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered the words aloud to the quiet car. I was not walking into this valley alone. I was walking in with the truth. At 0900 sharp, I did not report to Womack Army Medical Center. Instead, I and a calm, sharp-eyed civilian lawyer named David Chen, whom Maggie had recommended, walked into the JAG building. We didn't head for a sterile examination room. We headed for a pre-scheduled meeting in a formal conference room. My call to the Inspector General's office had triggered an immediate, high-level response. When we entered the room, it was already occupied. 3 senior JAG officers sat at a long, polished mahogany table. 2 male colonels and a female lieutenant colonel with shrewd, intelligent eyes. An investigator from the IG's office, a master sergeant with a face that had seen everything, sat in the corner, a notepad open before him. And at the far end of the table, looking deeply uncomfortable and blindsided, was the colonel who had signed my evaluation order. His face was a mixture of confusion and irritation. He had expected to hear about a hysterical lieutenant being escorted to the psych ward. He had not expected to be summoned to JAG headquarters. My mental health evaluation had just been upgraded to an impromptu legal hearing. The lieutenant colonel, the senior officer in the room, gestured for us to sit. First Lieutenant Peeney, she began, her voice professional and devoid of emotion. We have received a serious complaint from you via the IG's office regarding the order for your command-directed evaluation. You have alleged abuse of authority and reprisal. This is your opportunity to present your case. I did not speak. I simply nodded to Mr. Chen. This was his stage. He placed his leather briefcase on the table, opened it, and took out a laptop and a small black USB drive, the one I had carried for months. He connected the laptop to the large monitor on the wall. I, the accused, became the prosecutor. Ma'am, colonels, Mr. Chen began, his voice calm and respectful. First Lieutenant Pina contends that this order is not a legitimate concern for her well-being, but a direct and malicious act of retaliation intended to silence her and discredit her as a witness to criminal activity. The evidence to support this claim is substantial. For the next 2 hours, the silent, air-conditioned room became a theater of truth. Mr. Chen was masterful. He didn't narrate with passion. He presented facts with cold, irrefutable logic. He started with the emails, displaying the thread that began with the subject line, "The Rose Problem," showing the clear intent to fabricate a mental health crisis. He moved on to the financial statements, highlighting the fraudulent insurance claims for Serafina's prenatal care under my name. Then came the audio files. He played the recording of Matilda's cloying phone call, ordering me from my own home. And then, the finale. The audio I had recorded from the hallway. Jax's arrogant, dismissive voice filled the silent room. She won't dare. Mom already spoke to Colonel Miller. The second she shows a single sign of instability, He'll sign the order for a command-directed psych eval. It's the perfect trap. As his voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, I watched the colonel at the end of the table. Every drop of blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy mask of sheer panic. He was Colonel Miller. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than anything I'd ever experienced. It was the silence of guilt, of complicity, of a system staring its own corruption in the face. The JAG officers exchanged long, meaningful looks. Their eyes shifted from the screen to me, and finally settled on the now sweating Colonel Miller. The lieutenant colonel broke the silence. She looked directly at me, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something other than professional detachment in her eyes. It was respect. "First Lieutenant Pina," she said, her voice firm, "you have faced an extraordinary and deeply disturbing situation with a level of professionalism that is a credit to your uniform. Thank you for trusting the system to work." She then turned her sharp gaze to the Master Sergeant from the IG's office. Her next words were the sound of the entire game being flipped on its head. "Master Sergeant, I believe we have more than sufficient grounds to immediately suspend this mental health evaluation. Furthermore, I am recommending we open a full Article 15-6 investigation and potentially a criminal inquiry into Captain Jackson Thorne on suspicion of assault, abuse of authority, fraud, and conduct unbecoming of an officer." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "And Colonel Miller," she added, her eyes like ice, "you and I will be having a separate conversation about your relationship with the Thorne family and your decision-making process." The investigation into me was officially over. The war against the Thorne dynasty had just officially begun. I stood, gave a crisp salute, and walked out of the conference room with Mr. Chen. As the heavy door closed behind me, I stepped out into the bright North Carolina sunlight. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I took a deep, full breath of clean, free air. 6 months after the hearing at the JAG office, I walked into the main courtroom at Fort Bragg. A military court-martial is a world unto itself. It has a gravity that even a civilian federal court lacks. The air is colder, the lines are sharper, and the stakes feel higher. It's not just about law, it's about the bedrock of the entire military institution: honor. The room was paneled in dark wood, the flags of the United States and the U.S. Army flanking the judge's bench. The jury, or the panel, as it's called, was composed of 7 senior officers, all colonels and lieutenant colonels. Their faces were impassive, their uniforms immaculate, their gazes missing nothing. These were men and women who had led soldiers in combat. They had no patience for excuses or lies. I was in my own dress uniform, seated in the front row reserved for witnesses. I felt a profound sense of calm. The fight was no longer mine to wage alone. I had handed my evidence, my truth, over to the system I had sworn to serve, and now the system was acting. I didn't need external inspiration anymore. I was not the scared woman hiding a USB drive. I was a witness. I was an officer. I was a survivor, and my survival was its own inspiration. When they called me to the stand, I moved with a practiced composure. The lead prosecutor, a sharp, relentless major from the Trial Counsel Assistance Program, guided me through my testimony. I didn't speak with emotion. I spoke with the objective clarity of an intelligence officer delivering a battlefield assessment. I presented the facts, the timelines, the chain of events. The evidence spoke for itself. The most damning moments came when they played the audio recordings for the court. The sound system was crystal clear. Matilda's saccharine voice, dripping with poison as she ordered me from my home. Jax's arrogant laugh as he laid out his perfect trap to have me declared mentally unstable. His cruel, dismissive words echoed in the dead-silent courtroom, each one a nail in his own coffin. I watched the panel members. Not a single muscle moved in their faces, but their eyes hardened into chips of granite. When it was Jax's turn on the stand, he tried to project the same old confidence, but it was a brittle facade. Dressed in his own service uniform, stripped of its authority, he looked smaller, diminished. Under the prosecutor's methodical surgical cross-examination, he began to unravel. He tried to blame everyone but himself. the pressure of command, the stress of his father's legacy. He painted himself as a man manipulated by a conniving mother and seduced by a vulnerable woman. He tried to portray me as an emotionally distant, career-obsessed wife who had driven him away. It was a pathetic, cowardly performance. The prosecutor dismantled his excuses one by one, using my evidence, the emails, the financial records, the timeline of his deceit, to corner him. "So, Captain Thorne," the major said, her voice dripping with cold contempt, "you're saying your mother forced you to commit federal insurance fraud? Your mistress forced you to assault your wife? The pressure of your job forced you to conspire to illegally end a fellow officer's career?" Jax's face was slick with sweat. He looked at the panel, searching for a sympathetic face and finding none. He looked at his own defense counsel, who could offer him nothing. His eyes finally landed on me. He saw no fear, no anger, just a calm, steady gaze. And in that moment, he finally broke. "All right, I did it," he shouted, his voice cracking, the sound of a man self-destructing. "I did it all. Are you happy now?" The outburst was shocking in its suddenness. A wave of satisfaction should have washed over me. I had waited months to hear those words, to see him brought low by the weight of his own crimes. But as his confession hung in the air, I felt no glee, no triumphant surge of victory, only a vast, cold emptiness. The game was over. The monster had been revealed. And all that was left was the wreckage. The panel didn't deliberate for long. They returned in less than an hour. The senior member, a grim-faced colonel, stood and read the verdict in a clear, formal tone. On the charge of assault in violation of Article 128 of the UCMJ, guilty. On the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, Article 133, guilty. On the charge of adultery, Article 134, guilty. On the charge of fraud, Article 132, guilty. The sentencing was delivered swiftly and brutally. Captain Jackson Thorne was to be reduced in rank to Private E1. He was sentenced to a dishonorable discharge, the military equivalent of an execution, a permanent stain that would follow him for the rest of his life. He would forfeit all pay and allowances, including his entire retirement pension, and he was to be confined for 10 years at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The gavel fell. The Thorne dynasty, a name that had carried weight and influence at Fort Bragg for decades, had officially crumbled into dust. The fallout was immediate. Matilda Thorne, though not criminally charged, became a social pariah overnight. The doors that had always opened for her were slammed shut. The friends who had once clamored for her invitations now crossed the street to avoid her. Her carefully constructed empire of influence and reputation evaporated like smoke. And Serafina Vance? She had vanished weeks before the trial even began, disappearing without a trace, a ghost who had played her part and fled the stage. After the verdict was read, I stood up, saluted the panel, and walked out of the courtroom. I stepped into the afternoon sun, the heavy courthouse doors closing behind me with a solid, definitive thud. An invisible weight, a burden I'd carried on my shoulders for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it, simply lifted and dissolved into the air. The war was over. I had won. A year can change everything. A year after the verdict, I pinned on the twin silver bars of a captain. The promotion ceremony was small, attended by the only people who mattered, Maggie, a handful of trusted friends from my unit, and my lawyer, David. There was no grand party, just a quiet, heartfelt celebration that felt more real than any I'd ever experienced before. A month after that, I took a week of leave and flew to Kansas. The drive to Leavenworth was long and flat, the landscape stretching out under an endless sky. The United States Disciplinary Barracks is not a place of hope. It's a fortress of consequence, a stark, imposing structure of brick and steel where the Army sends its most disgraced members to be forgotten. I walked into the visitor's room, a sterile, echoing space that smelled of antiseptic and regret. When they brought Jax out, I barely recognized him. He was no longer the confident, arrogant Captain Thorne. The man who sat down opposite me, separated by a thick pane of reinforced glass, was a stranger. He was thinner, his face gaunt, his eyes holding a dull, resentful bitterness. The swagger was gone, replaced by the shuffling gait of a man stripped of his name, his rank, and his future. He wore a drab prison jumpsuit, the fabric the color of dust. He picked up the phone receiver on his side of the glass. I picked up mine. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice a rasp, devoid of its former charisma. There was no greeting, just the raw edge of his anger. "Came to gloat? To see what you did to me?" I looked at him, not with hatred or pity, but with a strange, detached clarity. I saw a small, weak man who had been broken not by me, but by the weight of his own choices. "I didn't come here to forgive you, Jax," I said, my voice calm and even. "Forgiveness is something I'm working on for myself, not for you. I came here to thank you." A look of baffled fury crossed his face. "Thank me? For what? For this?" He gestured vaguely at his surroundings. "You tried to destroy me," I said, leaning slightly closer to the glass. "You and your mother built a cage of lies and violence and expected me to die inside it. But you miscalculated. You didn't understand the person you were trying to break. Instead of destroying me, you showed me exactly how strong I am. You stripped away everything I thought I needed, your approval, your family's name, the life I was supposed to have, and you forced me to find what was truly mine. My strength, my honor, my will to survive. You gave me a purpose, Jax. You gave me a war to win. And I won." I placed the receiver back in its cradle without waiting for his reply. I stood up, turned, and walked away. I did not look back. I left him there, a ghost in a beige room, trapped with the bewildering, infuriating truth of his own epic failure. That chapter of my life was finally, completely closed. The first thing I did when I got back to North Carolina was sell the house. I sold the polished floors he'd struck me on, the kitchen where his mother had insulted me, the bedroom that had become a cold and lonely battlefield. I sold the memories and the ghosts along with the drywall and the granite countertops. With the proceeds, I bought a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet complex just a few miles from the base. It was cozy, filled with light, and it was entirely mine. For the first time, I felt like I had a home, not just a set of quarters. My definition of family had been rewritten. It was no longer a rigid structure defined by blood and obligation, but a fluid, living thing built on loyalty and love. Maggie O'Connell, who checked in with me every week without fail, had become the mother I always deserved. My real family was the loud, laughing group of friends and fellow soldiers who now gathered in my small living room every Sunday evening. The tense, performative Thorne family dinners were replaced by chaotic, joyful potlucks. We'd crowd around my small dining table, sharing cheap beer and homemade casseroles, our conversations loud, honest, and real. This was my chosen family, my tribe. My work found a new purpose, too. At Fort Bragg, I became a quiet but firm advocate for junior female soldiers. I volunteered for the official mentorship program, where I was assigned to guide young lieutenants fresh out of officer candidate school. I shared my story, not the gory details, but the lessons learned. I taught them more than just military tactics and leadership skills. I taught them how to recognize the red flags of a toxic relationship, personal or professional. I taught them how to establish boundaries, how to document everything, and where to go for help when the system itself seems to be against them. My scars were no longer a source of shame. They had become a shield, a map I could use to help others navigate their own dark valleys. I'd come to understand a new philosophy, one forged in fire. True discipline isn't about enduring pain in silence. True discipline is having the courage to fight for your own peace. The story ends and begins again on a cool, clear North Carolina morning. Captain Rose Pina, me, stood at the front of my company, the crisp pre-dawn air biting at our cheeks. "All right, let's move," I called out, and we fell into the familiar, rhythmic cadence of a morning PT run. As our boots hit the pavement in unison, the sun began to rise over the tops of the tall pine trees, painting the eastern sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink. I felt the warmth on my face, a deep, profound sense of peace settling over me. I had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and I had feared no evil. I had fought my war, and I had won. And now, every steady, powerful step I took was not a flight from the past, but a march toward a future. A future I had built with my own two hands. A future founded on honor, discipline, and a quiet, unbreakable respect for the soldier I saw in the mirror. My war on the home front is over, but I know that for many of you, your own battles are still being fought every day. I learned that true discipline isn't about enduring pain in silence. It's about having the courage to fight for your own peace. This story was never just about me. It was for every person who has been made to feel small, invisible, or powerless. If it gave you strength, please consider liking this video and sharing it with someone who needs to hear that survival is possible. For more stories of resilience and the fight for justice, make sure to subscribe. And in the comments, let's create a testament to our strength. Just write two simple words: still standing. Still